Okay, welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you're watching from. My name is Nicola Zingales. I'm a professor at FGV Law School in Rio de Janeiro, and I want to welcome you to this last installment in our series on online content moderation and freedom of expression. Today we are going to focus on artificial intelligence and online content moderation. And we have a set of distinguished panelists with us. So we have in particular three speakers. The first one is Eduardo Celeste from University of Dublin City. He's assistant professor in law, technology and innovation at the law school. He's one of the founders of the Digital Constitutionalism Network, and his PhD thesis, Digital Constitutionalism, the Role of Internet Bill of Rights, examines how the digital revolution is changing contemporary constitutionalism and explores the constitutional roles of Internet Bills of Rights. He has previously studied law at University of Rome, La Sapienza, and University of Paris II, Panthéon-Assas, and at King's College, London. He's an alumnus of the European Law School, Humboldt University to Berlin, and we're very happy to have him with us. So thank you, Eduardo, and welcome. Let me also briefly introduce the two other speakers. So the second speaker is Jörn Reinhardt from University of Bremen. He's a professor of public law there since 2018. He has a BA in law and philosophy from Freie University Berlin and from University of Essex in England. His PhD in public law from the University of Hamburg, DAAD, former scholar at the Michel Ville Paris Institute, and also fellow from the University of Bielefeld in Germany. And so welcome also, Jörn. And then we have Nuno Teixeira Castro from University of Lisboa. He's a researcher at the Cyber Law Research Center of the law school at the University of Lisboa. He has a BA in law, and he's the editor of the scientific magazine at the University of Lisboa. So also welcome, Nuno, to the conversation. Now I will leave the floor to Eduardo, reminding everyone that we have about 20 minutes each for the presentation, and we'll have some time for Q&A. We'll also be taking questions from the YouTube, and for the people who are connected on Zoom, we'll be also checking the chats there. So Eduardo, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Many thanks, Nicola, for the very detailed introduction, and really thank you very much to all the organizers for having me today. So I have the unmerited privilege to open this workshop today. So what I would like to do before presenting some of the findings of my research, Nicola mentioned that some of my research projects which are focusing on the concept of digital constitutionalism, I would like to say a couple of words on this. Since I have the honor to start first, I would like first of all to set the scene about the topic of artificial intelligence and online content moderation. I think that would be particularly helpful for the students who are watching this webinar, and also for our discussion. So I was actually doing some literature review before starting our seminar, and I would like therefore to arbitrarily categorize the problems related to artificial intelligence and online content moderation into three different categories. Of course, the assumption, the starting point of all this debate, at least from a legal point of view, is that, well, in the social media environment, in the environment generally of online platforms, is impossible to allow every type of content. So we can mention different examples: terrorist content, hate speech, content that violates intellectual property rights, but also content that, for example, infringes particular rules imposed by platforms, such as, for instance, nudity. So of course I mentioned only some example, but just to show you example of content that could be perceived as prohibited to be published online. Therefore, the necessity of having online content moderation, which could be generally defined as the activity performed by online platform, essentially to select, to identify which content is not supposed to be maintained online, in very, very general term. Then, starting from this assumption, there are a series of problems related to this activity of online content moderation. In particular, we could identify three main phases that I would like to present. So we have the first phase, which has been called by the scholarship the creation phase. What is the creation phase? The creation phase is related to the principles that should or will regulate online content governance. Then we have a second phase, which is the enforcement phase. So when the stage in which those rules which have been created and established are implemented by the platforms or by other actors, and in particular today we're going to discuss about how they are implemented through artificial intelligence tools. And then there is the third phase, which is called the phase of the response. So once the moderation has already occurred, what are the tools available to the users or to the platform in more generally to correct the first result of online content moderation. So of course we can debate on whether this categorization corresponds to the reality, but I think that it is important for us at least to have a general scheme of the debate. And in particular, as I will have the chance to explain in a moment, my research focuses primarily on the first phase, on the creation phase. But let me just provide you for a couple of minutes a more detailed presentation of these three different phases and of the aspect that I deem are more problematic from a legal perspective. So as I said, the first phase is the phase of creation of rules. So here essentially we need to moderate the content online, we need some rules. What are therefore the options? Already from the few examples that I just provided you, such as like terrorist content, hate speech, and nudity, you could immediately understand that not all of these examples actually are types of content prohibited under state law. So I mentioned, for instance, nudity, and apart from like some specific countries, nudity is generally not a type of content which, for instance, is prohibited by many state laws. So very generally, and with the risk of oversimplifying, we could say that there are two main actors that can establish that are active in the creation phase related to online content moderation. We have on the one hand states and or more generally, we would say like the state dimension, so involving also like supranational entities or interstate entities. And on the other hand, we have the platform themselves. Platform themselves that can be conceived and regarded as a sort of like private communities, as like a private association. No? We decide to create our, I don't know, we have our cluster of friends or members, we create a private club, and therefore we decide our own rules. And of course, in the offline world, there are many examples of these different kind of association, which they establish their own private rules, also related to what is the content in terms of like speech accepted within the community. Therefore, if you look at these two actors, so the state dimension and the platforms on the other end, we can identify a series of problems. So first of all, in relation to the state dimension, we have the question of how to develop these rules, because indeed some of these rules could have been in place since already like the offline times where digital technology was not so advanced, but there are other kind of rules which can be underdeveloped at state level or that are present in some states and are not present in other states. So first of all, there is the problem of development of those rules. There is the problem of creating legal provision to address challenges that might be new in the context of some legal systems. And a factor that I already mentioned, of course, here when we talk of state law, of course, we cannot imagine a single state law dominating the whole issue related to online content governance. Of course, online content governance is performed by platforms which are global users, and therefore is really difficult in an environment which, at least at first sight, doesn't know any boundaries, then to transpose the traditional Westphalian approach of having like one state, one territory to this environment. Therefore, I think that is somehow natural to see a problem of fragmentation here, or at least of like legislative pluralism. So we have different states which of course aim to enforce their own rules related to content moderation. And of course, from the platform perspective, there is the problem of how to reconcile all those different perspectives. So these, in my opinion, are really oversimplifying the problems related to the state dimension. Then there are a rather series of issues related to platform values. So we have said that the second important factor in establishing these rules are the platform themselves. And here again, there is the question of developing those rules. There is the question also of who should establish these rules. This is not a question in the state environment, because at least in democratic system, there are some principles related to which essentially entrust the state the power to make law. So the question of legitimacy is not so prominent in the state dimension, but certainly is present at the level of platforms. So who is entitled, who has the power to establish the values of the different platforms? And then, of course, another objection or point that can be raised from a legal perspective in relation to platform values is but if these spaces, platforms, are becoming so important in the everyday life of the individuals that people really perceive that equate online platforms with modern public squares, we could say. So the question is, why should we impose, for instance, stricter rules in those environments in comparison with the rules that generally govern physical public squares? So again, I can reiterate the example of nudity, which in general is not a type of content which is prohibited by state law, but conversely can be prohibited at the level of platform. So why should we abide by this rule and imposing this rule while in reality those platforms have really become the modern public square? Then we can start analyzing the legal issues related to the second main category, the category of enforcement related to online content moderation. So here the problem is that the scale of the issues related to content moderation is such that states alone don't have the instrument to enforce their own rules. Therefore, what we can observe very generally is a shift, a power shift from state to platforms. So essentially what states do is to delegate the power to enforce their rules to private platforms. So first of all, from a general perspective, especially focusing on recent legal trends, we can observe that is at odds with the types of legislation that have allowed those platforms to grow and to proliferate. So I don't want to enter into the details, but generally we could say that in the most legal systems, platforms, online platforms were protected by the legislation because were considered types of internet service provider not directly active on content. So they were supposed to play a passive role in relation to content. So just to provide you an historical perspective, then here the problem is the legislation has established a series of safeguards, a series of liability exemptions in relation to in favor of these platforms, because the legislation supposes that those platforms play a passive role. And here you can immediately understand that this at odds with this current shift that we can observe of power from states to platforms. So if platforms become more active from this point of view, there is therefore the legal issue of adapting these pieces of legislation. And the general question, should we therefore continue to protect these platforms if they have a say, if they are more active in terms of online content moderation? But apart from this issue, the problem is here that, of course, platforms themselves, they have to cope with this huge issue of online content moderation, which is already huge for states, but is not to be underestimated also at platform level. And this is where exactly the artificial intelligence part comes and starts to play. So here, the online platforms don't have essentially a choice, because the states started to push them to enforce the rules in a very limited amount of time, with the risk of incurring in fines, with the risk of being subject to specific, more stringent legal provisions. And therefore, the solution, of course, that these companies started to implement is to use artificial intelligence tools, systems of automated decision-making, which are based on systems of machine learning, essentially. However, these, we could call them machines, these automated systems, of course, have some shortcomings, as you may understand. So imagine that they are performing the task that in the physical world generally judges and lawyers would perform. So in relation to the first phase, to the creation phase, here is the big problem is, yes, of course, we might have already some rules set, but the big problem is how to translate these rules into the algorithm, into the code of this machine. How is possible to do that? So imagine that already judges in the physical world struggle to interpret these legal rules and apply them to facts of real cases. So imagine doing this task and performing this task by, I don't know, developers that have to translate these legal rules and then implementing these rules at the levels of machine. And of course, apart from the rule setting part, there is the real problem of performing justice, which, of course, if we want to continue drawing this comparison between physical world and the online world, of course, everyone knows that it's already very complex administering justice in the offline world. So you can imagine performing this task at the scale of like millions of like posts published every day and contents uploaded on this online platform every single day. So you can imagine the complexity of this task. Therefore, the main shortcomings on which all the scholars more or less agree, of course, artificial intelligence applied in the context of online content moderation has its limitation. On the one hand, of course, at first sight, one may think that is an efficient solution, but in reality, this is only an illusion. It's an illusion because, of course, this method is imperfect. There is no transparency at the level of which rules are used by these systems in order to moderate content online. There are, of course, and this is an aspect that I would like to particularly stress, there are, of course, a series of chilling effects on fundamental rights. So, of course, machines they have to apply a series of rules on the basis of like predetermined systems. So their decision making is not really case by case. It's not the same time of reflection that the physical judge would do. And essentially the problem is since online platforms fear to incur in fines and sanctions by state, of course, the tendency is to amplify the level of potential censorship, and therefore the level of chilling effects on fundamental rights, and in particular, this is the topic indeed of this week of workshops, freedom of expression is, of course, is a danger in this context. To conclude this overview, let's mention now the main legal issues related to the last phase, the third phase, which is the phase of response. So we have just said artificial intelligence applied to the context of online content moderation has some limitation. What therefore can we do in order to limit the risk related to this series of issues is, of course, to provide users with a series of mechanisms of appeal, for instance, and to improve transparency. Many scholars and many activists are, of course, pushing platforms as well as the states, of course, to increase the level of transparency and the mechanism of redress in relation to online content governance. Of course, it's necessary to say that people should know that these mechanisms are available, which is not given for granted in this context. And of course, people should be effectively offered this mechanism, and this mechanism should effectively work. Therefore, all this introduction, which I try to, at least to, of course, oversimplifying, sketch the main legal issue, is just because I think that after this overview, one is tempted to say, to ask the question, why, therefore, if there are so many issues related to the application of artificial intelligence in the field of online content governance, why we should not go back to the traditional way of adjudicating cases? Why should we not entrust, for example, physical judges of this very complex task? So this, of course, is a temptation, of course, to look at the problem in this sense, but we could also look at the solution the other way around, and this is indeed what the scholarship is trying to do at the moment. So instead of bringing the problem back to the public and physical sphere, is essentially try to translate principles and mechanisms and rules which were valid and present in the public and physical sphere, in the sphere of these private platforms. So a factor that an important element that we need to stress is that one of the main issues that we are, this problem emerges in a context which is dominated by private platforms, private companies. Therefore, is devoid of all the kind of safeguards and guarantees which characterizes the public field dominated by states and public institutions. And therefore, I would like, and in order to conclude, I would like to bring to this question a bit something related to the findings of my research and the topic of digital constitutionalism. So if I had to answer this question, so do we need to go back to the public sphere, or we rather prefer to translate principles in the private sphere? I think that what is necessary to do is to start this work of translation of principles, especially constitutional principles, from the public sphere into the private sphere of online platforms. This is a process that I call a process of constitutionalization of online platforms. What is constitutionalization? Sometimes it's very confusing because we tend to associate the notion of constitution only with states and with citizens. But indeed, in the digital society, I think that the distinction between public and private is somehow blurred, and we need to take into account that dominant actors in the digital society are not only states but also private platforms. Hence, the reason to instill constitutional principles in the domain of private actors, such as online platforms. What are the main issues, and how we can conceive this task of constitutionalizing online platforms? So this is a recurring theme actually in the scholarship, that we will need to refer to these constitutional principles. Theoretically speaking, is an easy task, but in reality is very hard. And the reason is essentially historical, because those principles, those constitutional principles, have been developed with different actors in mind and for different contexts. Therefore, what is necessary to do is not simply to refer to this principle, but it's really like a process of translation. So I would really like to underline this concept of translation of principles. Translation, which essentially comprises two main tasks. On the one hand, we need to regeneralize those principles. So of course, constitutional principles now, they've been created and ideated in the context of states. We need to regeneralize them in order to get the sense, the flavor of these principles. And then when we understand really the value, the aim of this principle, we need to re-specify them in the context of online platforms. And this is a challenge because we don't know actually which actors should be entrusted with this task. At the beginning of this week, you had a discussion, a workshop on multi-stakeholderism, which is indeed one of the potential answers to this problem. Open questions that remain are, for instance, should states have the duty to actually generalize and re-specify those values in the context of online platforms, or is it rather a task that should be performed by a plurality of actors? And certainly my position is that I would be in favor of this second option, especially considering the addressees of these principles, which are no longer merely states, but certainly encompass a variety of different actors. And then to conclude and also to present some of the preliminary findings of a project that I'm currently conducting on digital constitutionalism and online content moderation, which has been recently funded by Facebook Research, is we don't have to actually underestimate the role also of civil society in this field. Indeed, the project that I'm conducting at the moment aims to look at civil society initiatives which have emerged over the past few years that are proposing principles to tackle the issues related to the application of artificial intelligence and more generally to online content moderation. Why am I stressing the importance of these civil society initiatives? Because when we talk of a process of constitutionalization, we immediately think of constitutional courts, constitution, interstate organization, but we somehow neglect the role that civil society actors might have in this constitutional process. So in the real world, or from an historical perspective, civil society has been involved in different ways, for instance, in constituent assemblies and so on. But what is the constituent assemblies of the 21st century? How we can make sure that everyone's voice is heard in this context. And therefore the need, and I hope I will be able, myself and the team which is collaborating with me on this project, to present the findings of this work soon. We hope that we will make clear what the civil society at the moment is advocating in terms of principles and values that should be absolutely included in the context of online content moderation. So I see that Nicolò is looking at me in the camera, so I think that I finished my time. So thank you very much again for your attention, and I look forward to your question in the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Eduardo. This is a very clear and comprehensive overview of the challenges that lie in front of us in this space. And also I want to thank you for giving a plug for the concept of platform value that it was featured, was actually the title of a special issue that I co-edited with Luca Belli in the Computer Law and Security Review. And it has many open access papers that are available. And basically one of the key questions that we discussed there is exactly what kind of value should be embedded in this regulation of platforms, both by regulators and by platforms themselves, because as you said, this is a shared regulatory space. And what can we do to ensure that this is transparent and sufficiently transparent to society, and that we get it right in the first instance? Because the problem is, as you pointed out, that once you embed these values into artificial intelligence systems, they get amplified, and therefore it's particularly important to get it right from the beginning. So with that comment that I couldn't refrain from doing, I will now move to the second speaker. So Jörn, you have the floor.
Thanks a lot. My name is Jörn Reinhardt. I'm currently working at the University of Bremen as a professor in public law. Thanks very much for the invitation. 2 years ago, I had already the occasion to participate in a couple of seminars and conferences in Porto Alegre by invitation of Ingo Salet, and I'm happy to somehow return to Brazil, even only for an online conference and in these rather difficult times. I think I can follow up quite well on Eduardo. I'm very glad to get to know also what I want to say in advance, the other institutions like the Institute of Public Law in Brasilia, IDP, and I'm myself working in the field of public law. And my focus today on our subject, content moderation and artificial intelligence, is from a constitutional law perspective, fundamental rights perspective. So this is why I think what Eduardo said, I can jump in here. And my broader research interests concern the legal framework for democratic public spheres in general. That does not only involve social media, of course, but also the old and, if you want, venerable institutions of the constitutional state, such as parliaments, traditional mass media. But social media is an increasingly important part of it. And even though we as academics sometimes exaggerate maybe the importance, but it is an important thing. So, and on this conference, we've heard about already, as you've mentioned, Eduardo, different stakeholder models of internet governance, concepts of regulations against fake news. Especially yesterday, we've already seen what I think the limits of artificial intelligence. I mean, artificial intelligence is often presented in this context. And this has also been sort of promoted by social media CEOs as the solution to all our problems of content moderation. But what we have seen, there are severe limits so far. And what I will do today is address the tension and the limits, the tensions between automatic content moderation, artificial intelligence, and what is required from the perspectives of the law and the perspective of fundamental rights in this field. So this tension is and the key question, or the central question of my presentation is, to what extent do we have to take into account the reality of automated content moderation, which is something completely different than the marketing of automated content and artificial intelligence content moderation. So to what extent do we have to take this reality into account? Do we have to modify our normative standards, or do we have to insist on them? This is sort of the theme I'm trying to develop on a little bit. Last preliminary remark. What I will say in the following is formulated from a specific, particular European, maybe even I would say German point of view, German understanding of constitutional law, of fundamental rights, which always goes on the assumption that there are comparatively strong ties of private companies to fundamental rights. There's a strong horizontal effect. And what I presuppose in a certain sense is a legal system with a constitutional court in the background, high level of acceptance, constitutional court, which has always in Germany formulated and continues to formulate strong guidelines for the design of the media order on the basis of fundamental rights provisions. And this is something which I would say is not universalizable, I'm afraid. I mean, if you look at the US context, it's a completely different story. When you talk about content moderation, artificial intelligence, you don't have this doctrinal background with a strong horizontal effect and everything. And therefore, these two preliminary remarks, first of all, it is a very specific context, and I'm not sure whether this is universalizable. And even though, I mean, different themes in a comparative perspective are interesting, we are dealing with the same problems in the different legal orders, but we are giving very different answers. And this is would also be a reservation against this idea, and we should discuss about it afterwards, against this idea of a constitutionalization, or this idea of one, maybe human rights approach, which fits in all these legal orders, because the landscape is very, very different and diverse. So I have not prepared a presentation, but I have a little agenda, and I thought I might just put this in the chat on Zoom, but I'm not sure. So this is my agenda. I'm not sure whether everyone can see this, whether the participants on the other participants cannot, but it is not so important. That was an idea, because usually if you have a presentation, the whole screen is full. But it is only a small agenda anyway. The first thing is first remarks are on content moderation and artificial intelligence. Why do we need automated decision-making processes and content moderation, and since when has this been going on? The second point is horizontal effects of freedom of expression. This is my second remark. What are the normative standards and how do we construct this horizontal effect? Short remarks on this one, because we've heard in the first panel and also yesterday, I think, a little bit about horizontal effects, so this will not be too long. And the last and concluding point is, what are the implications for the use of artificial intelligence? So what are the normative implications of this technology for our understanding of the fundamental rights in question in the background? So I start with content moderation that has always been going on behind the screens, so to speak, in order to quote a book by, it's a little bit of pity, that the others cannot see this, but this is a book by Sarah Roberts. Lots of people know probably. Here's the book. She has an American scholar who has made clear that the practice of content moderation has always been going on behind the screens, and it is not only, as sometimes presented in Germany or in Europe, it's not only an effect of NetzDG and regulatory approaches. It's always been going on, and the COVID-19 crisis has brought to light and emphasized a little bit these standards and practices of content moderation that were always on these platforms. So first of all, there are standards, normative standards, which are enforced by the social networks through terms of services, community standards, as Eduardo already pointed out as well. And there are practices of content moderation that are always there. And in the COVID-19 crisis to a larger scale, also in automated fashion, because these call center structures that are at the basis of content moderation, which is sort of the people who have seen the film The Cleaners, they get an idea of what content moderation means, sort of like in these large call centers, automated, people in front of the screen deciding yes, no, in a very short period of time. This has been sort of shifted, apparently, after we report also Freedom House from last week. They've also mentioned it and outlined it to more automated practices, artificial intelligence, technology tools for different reasons. First of all, you need automation in this respect because of the sheer mass of content. You have to deal with this. And in the COVID-19 crisis, in particular, the people could not work in these environments. They had to go home, and therefore artificial intelligence had to take over with all the collateral damages that go along with it, because it's quite restrictive, and the artificial intelligence tools that are used by the platform. So, and Facebook in a statement from October has also stated that even for Facebook groups, not for the platform as such, but also for the particular Facebook groups, artificial intelligence is used. Our community standards, I quote this now, apply to public and private groups, and our proactive detection tools work across both. And that means even if someone doesn't report an issue to us, our AI can detect potentially violating content, and we can remove it. So stating that 1.5 million pieces of content in groups for violating our policies were removed, and 91 of which we found proactively, so through these automated mechanisms. This is sort of the reality of content moderation in a very short fashion. And this is a rather rough form of content moderation sometimes, and there's a rather stark contrast to the fundamental rights obligations that are in the background. And I will just shortly remind us of these horizontal effects of freedom of expression that are in the background, and where do they come from, at least from this German European understanding of human rights. I will not go into detail here and recapitulate from this in detail the development of this indirect horizontal effect doctrine. There is actually an essay or an article rather, which is also accessible in the materials of this conference. It's translated into Portuguese, and if people are interested in this development of the doctrine in the German Constitutional Court, they can sort of refer also to this Portuguese translation of my article. Just two remarks: the constitution, the concept of indirect horizontal effects works this way, that first of all, the state authorities that is bound by fundamental rights obligation, and private parties only indirectly through interpretation of, in this case, contract law, private law. But at the same time, the court has stressed since the Fraport judgment and on many other occasions, and I lay down these different steps in this development of this horizontal effect doctrine in this article. They have made clear that in certain circumstances, and in the Fraport decision, they even pointed to communication infrastructure, which you can maybe apply also to social networks, that in certain specific circumstances, depending on the content and the guarantee of the case, this indirect binding force, horizontal effect between private parties, can come close or even be the same as the binding force of the fundamental rights of the states. That means in certain situations, so we have to ask the question, are these social networks comparable to public sphere, for example, that would like as a public square would have to comply to public law standards, and can you apply this reasoning also on the platforms? That is an open question, and you can see that even though the big lines of this horizontal effect doctrine are seemingly clear since the 1960s, in Germany, the civil courts who have to apply this now on the social networks are, they agree on the basic idea, but disagree to what extent they really have to apply for freedom of expression to this social network like Facebook, for example. There are two lines of argument, and there are a number of courts who say, especially the Munich higher regional courts, the higher regional courts in Munich, has the tendency to say this looks like a public sphere, the communication sphere, and this therefore they have to respect fundamental rights all the way, and there is not much room for private autonomy or terms of service and particular standards of hate speech and COVID-19 and everything. Sort of there's a fundamental rights guarantee that is applicable here, and there are other regional courts which give private autonomy and the fundamental rights of these platforms, the media rights, for example, much more space. So that is the conflict in the background. The basic idea, horizontal effect, indirect, is rather clear, but the implications for the social media are not that evident. And there's still, we don't have a decision from a federal court yet. So waiting to clarify the dispute between these the various higher regional courts. So, but in any case, you have strong normative freedom of expression standards, horizontally applicable on these social media platforms. What are the implications now for the use of AI and automated content moderation? First of all, I think it is extremely difficult to determine the potential of AI technologies and to predict how they develop during the next 5 or 10 years. This is not only for legal scholars as us, but it is almost impossible, but also for the various interdisciplinary research teams and commissions that are reporting to government bodies and parliaments of the supranational level. And we had some members on the panels before, but for the moment, they all seem to emphasize the limitations of AI and that we will have to live with these limitations for some time. Yesterday, for example, we heard from Chris Marston about the limits of AI in detecting and dealing with disinformation. And at a certain moment, he quoted Mark Zuckerberg saying, it's much easier to build an AI system that can detect a nipple than it is to determine what is linguistically hate speech. So this remark, and this applies to disinformation, and this applies to supposed terrorist content and much more. So, and therefore, every 2 or 3 months, you can find an article in one of the major newspapers reporting the flaws of the Facebook algorithm. And I think this is in line with what Eduardo already said. Especially when it comes to images, video, anything visual, there are difficulties in really detecting what is allowed and what violates the terms of service and what not. So one recent example is an Australian user who was suspended for posting a 1900 image of Aboriginal men in chains, which resonates somehow these controversies, and you probably have heard about it, on the takedown of the Napalm girl. The famous Vietnam war photography, Tarleton Gillespie pointed this out in his book, Custodians of the Internet. So when it comes to identifying nudity, maybe, artificial intelligence technology gets it right more often than not, but it has obvious limits when it comes to difficult normative questions, detecting irony, a joke, a quotation, and let alone balancing the different rights in question, which you would have to do from a normative fundamental rights perspective. I mean, all the regional courts, regardless of whether they apply it fully, fundamental freedom of expression, it's always a balancing test that is required. It's always sophisticated reasoning that is required, and artificial intelligence cannot do the job so far. That is something that even the social networks realize now, who at the beginning, maybe out of marketing reasons, said otherwise. But it is obvious that, or let's put it this way, artificial intelligence at the beginning, maybe it's the first phase Eduardo was referring to, that seemed to be an attractive solution, but solution that is still very far away, even if you take like these neural networks or these new forms of artificial intelligence into account. So the situation is the following. Empirical research shows that AI cannot replace human decision-making and content moderation on the one hand, but on the other hand, it seems obvious that social media platforms need automated processes, algorithmic filtering, systems to cope with the sheer masses of online content. And there's a tension that needs a regulatory response somehow. And during this week, we have talked about possible responses from self-regulation, regulated self-regulation, and right up to binding rules and standards. This whole program Chris Marston was referring to yesterday. What I would exclude when it comes to the use of AI and moderating free speech is a mere self-regulatory approach with only a little bit private law in the background. I would say this is or cannot be enough. Fundamental rights, as I've pointed out before, have also a positive dimension, and they entail positive obligations on behalf of the state. The platforms themselves are not directly bound, but the state or the supranational entity has the obligation to give them, or to give fundamental freedom of expression at least an indirect effect. And the first one to whom these obligations are addressed is the legislator. So the legislative bodies, they have to provide a framework that acknowledges the necessity of artificial intelligence technologies. And I'm not saying this is sort of, I'm not sure whether you can universalize this idea, but from the background of this understanding of horizontal effect of fundamental rights, there's a positive obligation, and yeah, they have to guarantee somehow the importance of, or take into account the importance of freedom of speech. On the other hand, it would be disproportionate, I would say, to ban automated content moderation altogether. If this is the idea of the Digital Service Act at the moment, and I wasn't sure how to understand our first panel, whether this is really the plan to ban it altogether, then I would say this is also difficult, but this would be disproportionate infringements of the rights of the platforms, the freedom to conduct a business, and the media freedoms as well. So there has to be some sort of balance in the regulatory framework. I think you cannot do without artificial intelligence, but you have to take into account that freedom of expression is sufficiently weighed in. And you need safeguards that ensure that communication is not unduly compromised. Over-blocking, for example, would be a problem. And the different policy options are not determined by fundamental rights. I don't want to suggest this. Even if you have a strong concept of positive obligations and horizontal effects and all that stuff, it is first of all the legislator who has to realize it. But they have implications. I mean, in terms of transparency requirements, a reporting system, maybe the possibility to challenge, that is important, automated decisions, putback requirements when the algorithm has gone wrong. This is something that cannot be introduced by the courts, but needs legislation, and these broad principles are maybe something that can be derived from the guarantee of freedom of expression. In the absence of this regulation, and this is sort of more or less the state we are in, it is up for the civil courts to give indirect effect to freedom of expression by interpreting contract law, as I said. And I already mentioned the different approaches of the German higher regional courts. There are quite a few instruments to correct clauses that are unfavorable for the users, because German law at least knows a strict control of general terms and conditions. But the question remains to what extent freedom of expression trumps the interest of the platforms to make use of AI technologies. And this leads me to the questions I would like to discuss in conclusion, namely whether the platforms should be given a margin of maneuver, a scope of decision-making, and also a scope for automated decision-making, which in the end is not subject to full judicial review. I mean, just a couple of remarks. Why could this margin of maneuver, well, Nicolo is signaling that I should end my presentation here. Then I leave it with this question, and maybe we can come back in the discussion afterwards. What are the pros and cons of margin of maneuver for automated decision making or not? So thanks a lot.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Jörn. Yes, I'm sure there will be time to discuss more during the Q&A. I just want to thank you for the convincing argument about the insufficiency of AI. But at the same time, I entirely share the view that platforms are increasingly required to have some AI in order to cope with the immense amount of content that is available. So I think the key point for us to take home is that AI is just the start, not the end of the conversation. The fact that you are deploying AI. That is obviously, when you are a large platform, you need some form of AI, and that is arguably the most effective, efficient way of dealing with content in a preliminary manner. But then I would move beyond just identifying the content, which is one of the phases that Eduardo pointed out in his outline, and also, about the analysis and the type of responses that can be had. Those have all significant fundamental rights implications, and so we cannot just leave it to the AI. So you cannot stop the buck there. So with that, I would just move to the third presentation, and so I thank again and leave the floor to Nuno.
Hi guys, are you hearing me? Yes?
Yes.
Okay. Well, first, I had a presentation in Portuguese, but since everyone is speaking in English, and in order to keep the track of what is being said, I made a PowerPoint, and I just adapted to English, because discussion is always better discussion when we have some practical examples. And this one that I have here is about fake news, or what is fake news, or misinformation, or social engineering. And this just happened yesterday here in Portugal. I will try to put my PowerPoint. Can you see it? Oh, no, I have no, I cannot put. Can you allow me, Nicolo?
I'm not the host, but
yeah,
I'm sure.
Who's the host? Because
I can. Miela or Yasmin?
Yasmin, can you allow me to share my PowerPoint?
Sorry, who is dealing with this thing? Or I think it's Gabriel.
Yeah, I think it's working now. Thank you.
Yes. Oh, okay.
You see fake news in the screen?
Yes. Yeah, we do.
You see fake news. Okay. My point is just to present the front page of one of the biggest newspapers here in Portugal, and the newspaper is this one here. Are you seeing? Público, I have a red marker. Can you see it? Yeah, in Portuguese it says something like the high-speed train that we don't have yet, and so far. should connect the two major cities between, that's written here, Oporto and Lisbon, in about 1 hour and 15 minutes. From now on, we take at least 3 hours to get from Lisbon to Oporto by train. This is the front page of the Jornal Público of yesterday, okay? This is yesterday. Okay, this I made a zoom in just, but Jörn, you understand? Are you following? Okay. Back 20 years ago, the same Público had this front page. Are you seeing? The same journey from Porto to Lisboa would take 1 hour and 15 minutes. This is July 6th, 1999. And the first front page that I showed was yesterday. 20 years after, we have the same title in the front page of a newspaper. Not to mention in the social media, Twitter and Facebook, all of the Portuguese were joking and making memes of it. But the nicest thing that happened is that we have fact checkers like Polígrafo. Are you familiar with Polígrafo, the machine? We made a program was called Polígrafo, and back in 1 or 2 months ago, another newspaper joined the television and made a second Polígrafo. So they made a fact check about the 2 front pages of the same newspaper. And what do you think that was the ending result? You saw, I haven't manipulated no image, okay? There are accurate front pages lasted in 20 years from one to another. But the curious thing was that as you see here, this is the newspaper Observador that made the fact check again with the television is TV, and they said that the 2 pages were not right because they were not the same news. Of course, they were not the same news. We're talking 1999, Portugal was something, and in 2020, Portugal is another something. But the title is almost the same. The only thing that is swapped is one says Porto to Lisboa and the other one said Lisboa to Porto. But the fact is the same. High-speed train that we don't have yet should connect the 2 cities, the major cities, Oporto and Lisboa, in 1 hour and 15 minutes. This is a very curious thing because the first thing to do is who would, in this case, tell us what is right or what is wrong? You think that the thing that this newspaper made, this fact check, is correct? Of course it's not correct, because you guys and the other ones that are following us in YouTube, they all saw the same thing. The thing from 1999 and the thing from 2020, they are just the same, okay? But it seems that the interpretation made by one single person is enough to tell you what is right or what is wrong. I don't believe so. We have here a big problem. Is the first one, to define what is fake. And I don't like the concept of fake news because you only have news. The other thing that is similar to news, but it is not, because the fundamental right that we are trying to achieve is the right to access information and to be informed. We have that in our Portuguese constitution. There's a fundamental right, okay? And each and every single person should have the right to be correctly informed and to access correct information. And the job that this fact checker did yesterday wasn't correct, right? Just a second. Okay. Can I take the screen back? Because it's just you only have you needed to see just the front pages, okay? The rest isn't needed because I had made it in Portuguese and I hadn't had the time to adapt it to English. So Jörn possibly wouldn't understand the same, and Eduardo, I don't know if you understand Portuguese. So let me see. Yasmin, have you taken the screen off?
Sorry, Professor, it's not me that is working with this.
It's done. It's done.
Host of the event, yeah. It's
okay.
Gabriela. Gabriela.
Okay, it's well.
Sorry.
To continue about the fake news, the one thing that I'm working besides in the Internet Society chapter, I belong to the Portuguese one, with Ruben Brave. You know Ruben Brave from the ISOC Netherlands? No, have you heard? No, okay. Ruben Brave is a fellow from the ISOC Netherlands, and he had a special program. don't laugh about the name because we have issues about the name, and the name is Make Media Great Again. I don't like the name because it sounds a lot like Obama campaign and after Trump's campaign, presidential campaign. But the project is Make Media Great Again. And the big problem that we have is that many of people are getting excluded from information. What is the point? The point is, newspapers and television, and so they are closing to premium content. And if we need to make that fundamental right of access information and giving access to correct information. When newspapers close the content in premium content, we are getting excluded persons, right? We have a lot of persons that cannot afford to pay for checking and to see news. Are you getting? Okay. And this is a big problem. How can we get confident, or can we had more confidence to newspaper when a lot of people are getting off the market, of information market, because they cannot afford to check, to see the news. And this is very difficult to get together, is to teach people to see and to check if what they are sharing is some sort of correct or right from a news perspective. And the other point is because the first thing that we used to do is we read the title and we share. We don't check the content of the title. The United Nations made a program, and they released this week, which is pledged to pause, because if we take a moment to have a deep breath and to, let me see what someone made me share from the WhatsApp. And the big problem there in Brazil is the sharing that a lot of Brazilians do throughout the WhatsApp. They only see the title, and the title most of the times is to give a big impact in person. And they say, oh, Mr. President has done something. Oh, another person has done something, and they share. And this network of sharing must stop. How? Well, pledge to pause, take a pause, breathe, check the title, see if that sounds familiar, if you are getting, sometimes if you heard before, okay? This program is in the United Nations, and the United Nations General Secretary, which is Portuguese, by the way, Antonio Guterres, yesterday or Tuesday, he made You can check. I don't have, but I will I will put the link there if you don't if you are not familiar with the program. Have you heard it, Nicola? The pledge proposed by the UN? No. Okay. It's just a natural thing that humans must do. Is a pause to breathe most of the times, because if we pause and breathe, most of the times we're not doing the thing. It's like having second thoughts, and when we have second thoughts, we are not so easily to make some action, and the action here is to share misinformation. And the problem is misinformation, not fake news. I don't like the concept of fake news, because news they report information. Fake news, for me, they don't exist. What exists is misinformation or social engineering to proceed to some sort of agenda that most of the times we don't know what the agenda is. QAnon has a certain agenda. I heard that QAnon, you know what is QAnon? Have you heard about QAnon? Yes, QAnon, no. QAnon, no. There are QAnons, yes, yeah. Jörn, do you want me to answer this question, Jörn?
Question. I think you can perhaps answer the questions after you finish the presentation.
Okay. My point is that we need to bring the person to the center of the problem, and the person must have the best tools to deal with the problem, and the problem is misinformation. We are not trained. Well, we jumped and we merged into social networks, and no one told us or taught us how to behave in social networks. So we bring all the behaviors that we have in normal and regular life here. That's why we love gossips, and we love to pick and see, oh, we made this, oh, we made that. Okay, we are persons. First of all, we are humans. We have all these human behaviors and cultural stuff that we bring into the networks and the social networks. This is a problem, because what we are discussing here is how a machine can control human behavior. And the intelligence, the artificial intelligence, is by now and so far made by humans, and by humans that add a lot of cultural and different cultural behaviors. Let's take, for example, the companies settled in Silicon Valley. Most of the times they extend their engineers to India, and India are not the same persons in America. Okay, they have cultural and a lot of cultural differences, and the Americans say, hey, you must do this. An Indian can put that, but most of the times it doesn't understand what is telling to do. And here we made another gap, and we are making another excluded persons, because we are trying to take norms as valid norms from some perspective to all of the community. And we cannot do that because we are imposing some sort of view, and we're not taking, well, multi-stakeholder is a quite and fancy word, but does it really apply?
Okay, is that it?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much, Nuno. So yeah, I think you also pointed out an aspect that we had been missing from the previous presentation, which is the role of the users, and
Yes.
the role of education in
Yes.
preventing the spread, for example, of fake news.
Yes.
I will now open up to questions, but I wanted to ask a clarification over your graphic. I was left with some curiosity, because when you pointed out the example of fact-checking, there were the options of true, false, right, and wrong. I wonder how a machine can distinguish between true and right.
What is the 0 and what is the 1? Yes. Yeah. Well, you had two identical images and two identical titles. Yes. The machine, I believe that the machine only says the 0 or the 1. Right. I believe that the machine would, of course, say both images were right. But the funniest thing is that the person that read the two titles made and said that was wrong. And the whole community said, well, that's not right, because we are saying this is right. That was in 1999. This is in 2020. They are the same. How can that person tell us that that is wrong? Because it was subtle enough to change, because one said Porto to Lisboa and the other said Lisboa to Porto, but it's the same. The machine would, of course, read that and say they are both identical, so that is right, or that is truth, not wrong, as the person made it yesterday.
So that's a very clear example of why we cannot leave it just to the machine, because they would not be able to tell whether it's true or not, but only if it's correct or wrong, or the opposite. Okay, thank you. So now I'll take questions. We have the first one here directly from Nuno, which you already mentioned. I think that's an interesting question that refers to the fact that in the GDPR, there is a specific media privilege, or a so-called journalistic exemption. So he wonders whether we should have something like that for content moderation. And that was directed specifically to you, but I guess Eduardo is also welcome to answer.
That privilege for journalists most of the time is because they had a code of conduct, and they have also an ethical code here in Portugal to get how do you say in English, cartão de jornalista, a journalist card, cédula profissional. Here in Portugal, we call it a cédula profissional. The
professional badge of journalism.
Professional badge, yes. But to achieve that, you need to pass, back on those days, they need to pass some tests. Nowadays, they can only to pay a fee and they give you the professional badge, okay? But back on 1990 and before, to get the professional badge, you need to pass some tests, and those tests were questions about the ethics and moral of the profession of journalist. That's why they had that privilege of, because they were the moderator between the source and the information, and they passed to people. And right nowadays, the profession is in deep damage. Most of the times, we don't have journalists like we had before. We don't have editorial content. Most of the time we check, and in the online news platforms, there are a lot of errors. They put the news, and 5 to 10 minutes later, they take it back because there are a lot of errors. There's what is missing there is the midpoint again. Who will do that job? Artificial intelligence or a human being? For me, I still believe that the middleman should be a human being, not artificial intelligence, because it is quite difficult to give common sense and to make common sense a string in artificial intelligence. And common sense is a human thing, not a machine thing. Well, at least so far. And what is missing most of the times is just that, the common sense.
Okay, thank you. Eduardo, do you want to comment on that?
Yes, I would like to comment on this. Thanks, Nicolò. Yes, I would like to echo what Nino just said in relation to this, and also comment on the example that he gave on the difference between the two front page of the newspaper. So it's evident that AI has some limitations in in a variety of contexts, but certainly in the context of online content moderation. Nevertheless, as Nicolas stressed, AI is necessary in the context of online platforms, because otherwise online platforms could not cope with the scale of this phenomenon. Really, like the question asked by Jörn triggered me a reflection about the role that the GDPR might have, because the GDPR, for instance, includes a provision or a series of provisions rotating around Article 22, which is specifically on online content moderation, which go in what Nino just stressed, so the necessity to preserve a part of the judgment to human beings. So there is something that cannot be merely performed by machines, but we need to preserve a part of like human judgment. And indeed, this might be a potential answer from the open question that Jörn presented at the end of this presentation. So the question how to strike a balancing between the platform's freedom to conduct a business and freedom of expression. If I had to answer this question more from the perspective of my research, therefore digital constitutionalism, looking at existing constitutional principles and trying to translate them in the context of online content moderation, I would certainly say that looking at the GDPR and at Article 22, so how online automated decision-making is balanced in the context of data processing, might be a useful direction to follow in the context of online content moderation. It might be a path that we could look at in order to orient the future balancing of this role. And I don't know if I have the time to ask a question to Jörn to elaborate a bit more, because I was fascinated by the fact that you mentioned the relevance of the German approach in this. So you rightly stressed that the rationale behind the courts of the decisions of German courts is the existence of the horizontal direct effect of fundamental rights in the German constitutional system. Therefore, I would like to ask you to elaborate a bit more on this, and just wanted to ask you the question: do you think that therefore, German case law will play a sort of special role on a global basis, having this horizontal effect, pushing therefore online platforms towards what I would call a constitutionalization of their values, or do you think that there might be other ways to put platform values more in line with constitutional norms? So I would be interested in knowing your views on this.
I would like just to add to that, and then leave the floor for Jörn, that it is not just the German approach, in the sense that also in Brazil there have been a number of cases that recognize the horizontal application of fundamental rights. Professor Ingo Sarlet is one of the specialists in this area. We also have a case in Poland against Facebook, and some US cases that, although they don't talk specifically about fundamental rights, they also apply a similar concept. So Jörn mentioned the public square or other analogies. So yes, is this a good way forward? Is this the right approach? Or, as Eduardo mentioned, we should perhaps also think about other models?
Shall I step in now? I would say, first of all, my reservation was, thanks for this question. My reservation were a little bit about, I didn't want to sound like sort of, these are the German problems at the moment, and this is universalizable, and therefore we just move on in this direction. Sort of this, I didn't want to, sort of this seems to be quite hegemonic, even though I'm completely aware that this idea of an indirect horizontal effect It's not a particularity of the German constitutional system. And Ingo Salet and many others have developed parallel ideas. The German Constitutional Court also takes like this public forum idea. It's some, it is from the American courts, and an adaptation in a certain way. So I completely agree on this. Do I want to take it as a model? Maybe. I mean, I find it attractive, but I'm skeptical that everyone else would find it attractive. And that you just can go on like this, sort of, these are fundamental rights, this is the doctrine, now we regulate sort of platform platform governance and content moderation. If you look at the discussions they have at the moment in the United States, they're completely different about Section 230 and First Amendment. I mean, I would say it is almost impossible. I mean, even in America, there are cracks in the American doctrine, and they shift a little bit. But this is a completely different understanding of the idea of fundamental rights, the idea of freedom of expression, and the responsibility of private entities. And I just don't think that you just can go into the world or to the US or anywhere, just say sort of this is sort of the reasoning. But from a constitutional law, comparative law perspective, you can identify certain themes which are relevant in the different jurisdictions. And one is this, the acknowledgement of this minefield of which these social networks are in, coming back to Eduardo's remarks. And this is what I wanted to point out in the beginning and to elaborate a little bit further, even though my time management in the end was not so successful. But the point is, I wanted to say that they have to, in a certain sense, they have to use these imperfect tools, artificial intelligence, and at the same time, fundamental rights standards apply to a very large extent. And then they are in this strange situation, minefield, so to speak, where they have to sort of, if they delete the content, then the user is not happy. If they don't delete it, then the different user might complain and say this is sort of a violation of my my right, my positions, because it is hate speech and stuff, and might drag them to a court. And even in the background in Germany, NetzDG is looming. They might even be liable if they don't take the content down in a very short period of time. And in this situation, at some regional courts, and this is what I was trying to argue in the end, some regional courts suggest maybe that there is some room for maneuver in the decision making, some scope of for the social networks. And I wanted to discuss, is this the right balance maybe? I'm rather against it, but that was the question I wanted to ask, put on the table, so to speak. I mean, do they need this room for maneuver or not? And is this sort of, because this seems to be a question where there's a balancing between fundamental rights on the one side and freedom to conduct a business, and also freedom of media freedoms on the part of the social platform as well. So you have to bring this somehow into a right balance.
Okay, thank you very much. That answered the question. There's a couple more questions. I think we can allow ourselves to be a couple of minutes late on schedule and try to answer these questions. I will try to tie them together so that I will pose it to you, and then everyone is welcome to comment. So basically the two questions are one about transparency practices of content moderation, and how we can ensure that in particular there is transparency over the algorithmic design. And another one is about how we could change the systematic bias that slips into databases. And I want to connect these two by mentioning a phenomenon that has been addressed recently in the literature, which is about the platforms having to cooperate between themselves in order to implement some of these measures that are being sort of ordered or expected from governments. Evelyn Douek has referred to content cartels, because this happens without actually nobody else knowing. They just get together, for example, in the case of terrorist content. They are required by government to detect, and find ways to moderate that. And platforms create a database and some criteria that they use to find this terrorist content, but nobody knows what these criteria are. So there you can have problems of transparency as well as problems of bias and marginal communities that are disproportionately affected by this kind of situation. So what can we do there? Do you have any ideas or suggestions?
So I don't know if I'll start being the first speaker. I will take the privilege then to start addressing very briefly this question. So the point about the transparency practices in algorithmic design, this is central to the question of artificial intelligence, the implementation of artificial intelligence in the context of online content moderation. This is one of the main debated issues generally related to artificial intelligence. How to cope with it? We have the way of classical traditional state regulation, but we have also an alternative way, which is to involve the platforms in better understanding the value of transparency. So in relation to this, I could mention some recent initiatives such as the Santa Clara principles, for instance, which are trying to push in this platform in adopting themselves these instruments as a tool, even to foster their position in the market, we could say. So we have, in any case, to remind that the online platforms are business providers, so we don't have, of course, to forget their nature. It's also important, it could also be valuable for them to use transparency as a tool to attract a specific market, even if it's not the primary aim generally. So I would see these two separate ways, so impose sort of like a bottom-up and top-down ways of imposing more transparency. And what you said in relation to the cooperation between platforms, the so-called content cartel, I read also some papers which were arguing more in favor of reducing the scale and the size of platforms in sort of like anti-capitalistic call to go against the current market trends of merging different companies and platforms together. Nevertheless, I think that the real driver indeed will be the capabilities of companies to create AI systems capable of addressing a state's need. At this point, what is concerning is the convergence between the needs of private companies and the needs of law enforcement authorities indeed. So there might be the risk that users will completely miss the point or the perspective that the law enforcement authority of their state are using private platforms then to hide some and to have some hidden aims that they want to pursue.
Yeah, perfect. Anyone else wants to comment on this?
Nicolo, my point with your question is all about compliance. We don't know. In order to have transparency, we should have access to some sort of ethical code of conduct or something, and someone needed to make that and check and examine if that is compliable or not, right? Who are the entities that are making compliance in Facebook or Instagram or WhatsApp? Do you know who is making that sort of examines? You don't know it, right? Most of the times they are made in-house, right? But they don't show us the results of some that compliance examine, right? In order to improve confidence among the users, well, make it a market or something. You should have someone capable to make compliance of that code of conduct. For me, is all about compliance, and given giving that exam to users so that we can trust or don't trust in that platform, online platform.
Yes, and I mean, just to reinforce that message, I totally agree. I think that it's not just about compliance. Compliance is the final part. There should be, ethical principles from the beginning. Otherwise, we risk going to, a biased database from which these decisions are made. So it should be perhaps, ethical content moderation or by design, and then a good system of compliance on top of that. I think
yes.
compromise that we all agree.
Yes, perfect, Nicole.
Perfect. So unless Jörn wants to add anything else, I think we can. You have unmuted yourself, so I guess you do want to say something.
No, just a quick remark. I mean, these two questions, as the others have pointed out, they belong together. How to get rid of the bias in algorithm? You need more transparency, and that does not necessarily mean that they sort of lay bare the algorithms themselves, but at least come up with the criteria. And this could be a way to reduce the bias that is always there in these automated decision-making processes, and there are many examples for it.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's another. Maybe a topic for another panel entirely, how to explain algorithmic decisions. But for today, we'll leave it here. I just want to invite Professor Ingo Sarlet to give final remarks over this entire week of amazing seminars. So I leave the floor to Ingo.
Thank you, Nicolo. I think I would talk in Portuguese because I think it's proper for the occasion, but I can of course start thanking so much your participation, your conduction, your presidency or coordination of the panel. Also thank very deeply Eduardo, Nuno and Jörn Reinhardt for their speeches, and they were very, very interesting. And I was following the whole conference here. I would also make questions, but we really must finish because our technological support. We must abandon our the floor soon. So I thank you all for being here today and taking part and bringing all this information and exciting subjects, issues to think about and study more. Bem, eu vou agradecer também agora, em nome da coordenação científica do evento, o professor Ivar Hartmann, o professor Danilo Doneda e minha própria, também a eles como coordenadores, co-coordenadores pelo trabalho feito, mas também as instituições, ao IDP, a FGV Law Rio e também a PUC do Rio Grande do Sul por darem suporte a esse evento, a toda a equipe de apoio logístico que nos acompanhou aqui desde o início, aliás, desde o início da projeção da execução desse seminário, que inclusive os convites, na formalização, a parte da logística, os contatos com os palestrantes, enfim, com os alunos, as inscrições, realmente tudo correu de forma excepcional, e também aos participantes, aos nossos discentes das seis instituições que acompanharam o evento, ao público externo, tenho certeza que foi de grande proveito. Também creio que depois haverá disponibilização das mídias, aquelas autorizadas pelos palestrantes, para algum acesso externo, e, portanto, declaro encerrado. Eu gostaria de nominar agora as meninas que nos ajudaram, a Joana, a Yasmin, a Gabriela do IDP, a Andressa da PUC, e eu precisaria saber se eu esqueci alguém, porque eu acabei não fazendo nenhuma anotação aqui, estou com o material do programa e definitivamente às vezes não lembro todos os nomes. Nominei todo mundo, gente, alguém me faltou, me diga, por favor, e me perdoe se eu não mencionado. Mas, gente, então...
Yasmin.
Yasmin não é bem referente. Yasmin, Joana, Gabriela, Andressa, and someone more?
Julia.
Julia. Of course. Thank you, Julia, again. Okay, então, declaro encerrada a sessão. I close the seminar and wish you a good week, good weekend, and all the best.
Thank you,
Bye.
Patrick.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank
care.
you.
Bye bye.
And I hope to see you soon.